Bonjour, bienvenue à la session sur les enfances transatlantiques entre l'Afrique et l'Amérique latine et les Caraïbes. Mon nom est Dominique Marchal, je suis l'organisatrice du panel. And this is a joint panel between CAAS, and it's sponsored by the Canadian Historical Association. So I brought my little poster there, and we tried to make that poster as inclusive as possible, because part of the reason the CHA is sponsoring this is because it's to try to convince people who are not historians of Canada that the CHA is for them. La Société historique du Canada a depuis longtemps souffert d'un manque de représentation d'historiens qui travaillent sur des régions en dehors du Canada, même l'Europe, mais beaucoup aussi l'Afrique puis l'Amérique latine. Puis une des raisons pour laquelle on a organisé ce colloque-là, c'est pour essayer de convaincre davantage d'historiens de l'Amérique latine, des Caraïbes puis de l'Afrique que la Société historique du Canada avait leurs intérêts à cœur. One of the things I did is I brought two of our bulletins. They are published three times a year. To show you, I wrote an article last winter about the history of Canadian history, the history of African history in Canada, and the relationships between CAAS and the CHA. C'est un article bilingue, puis il est ici. Si jamais vous voulez que je vous en envoie une copie en PDF, écrivez votre nom et puis votre courriel sur le papier. And the other article there is an article that was written by my predecessor at the CHA, the lady who was doing, like me, some outreach work, and she worked on the Caribbean, Juvenile Barros, and so she wrote about what it means to be a Caribbean historian living and teaching and researching in Canada. And that one we have tons of copies of, so you could pick it up on your way out. But for the other one, I need your email if you want a copy, so I'll just circulate this as we are speaking. Quand Hélène Rompré et moi-même nous sommes assises pour penser à un thème qui couvrirait l'histoire de l'Afrique et l'histoire de l'Amérique latine et des Caraïbes, le thème de l'enfance est venu très vite. C'est un sujet sur lequel on travaille toutes les deux, mais aussi un sujet sur lequel les historiens des deux régions se parlent souvent quand il s'agit de parler de méthode et de théorie, mais aussi parce qu'il y a beaucoup de thèmes qui sont partagés. Il y a des histoires communes dont on peut parler et il y a au moins deux des présentations aujourd'hui qui couvrent les deux continents d'une façon ou d'une autre. It's also a very good way to do meaningful comparisons. And it's a pleasure for me to host this because my department has just been successful in history at Carleton in creating two new fields at the PhD level. Actually, one new field, it's called African and Latin American Studies. And for a whole year, we had to sit in one board in front of the other after the other to convince them that these two regions could be put in the same region. And they were saying, what on earth do you put them together? So we spoke about liberation theories, we spoke about imperialism, colonialism, also the fact that the people who are in our department who are studying these fields teach together all the courses on the rest of the world and share a lot of the same concerns and the same public when it comes to talk to students. So it's a particularly auspicious time for us to host that session. And I will introduce people now and then invite them to come in order. So we've put the communications, the papers in a chronological order. Laurent Corbeil will come first. He's a PhD student at McGill University. Laurent va parler en français des enfants déracinés et identification ethnique, le cas des immigrants amérindiens de deuxième génération à San Luis Potosí au début du 17e siècle. Laurent va être suivi par Hélène Rompré, qui est une étudiante postdoctorale ici à Carleton et puis qui vient d'obtenir un poste permanent au Collège Sainte-Anne de la Chine, au Cégep. Elle va parler du travail, de la criminalité en Équateur, du milieu du 18e au milieu du 19e siècle, and she will do her presentation in English. Erin Bell is also a doctoral student at McGill. Her PhD is about Kenyan childhoods during the Mau Mau Revolution. And her paper is part of this, and it's about defining juvenile offenders in colonial Kenya, and it's an investigation of the incarceration of Kikuyu girls during the uprising. And finally, Marie-Louise studies at McGill, also at the PhD level. Marie-Louise is in history. Erin is in Asian, what is it? Indian Ocean program. And Marie-Louise is also, I'm also on the board of her PhD, so it's a pleasure to have her here. And she's working on humanitarian aid, education, and the British public, and she'll talk about nation building with care, bringing child health to Africa. So Laurent, it's your turn. They will all speak about 14 minutes, and we'll have at the end 20 minutes for discussion.
Eh bien, bonjour tout le monde. Merci d'être là. Je suis bien content d'être ici. Donc, voici. Le 6 juin 1591, plus d'un millier de Tlaxcaltèques sortirent de Tlaxcala, leur municipalité d'origine, et migrèrent en groupe unifié sur le Camino Real vers le nord, vers les terres Chichimec. Donc, les Chichimec qui étaient un groupe de semi-nomades au nord de la Nouvelle-Espagne. Leur marche dura environ 6 mois, au terme desquels 6 mois, 230 d'entre eux s'établirent dans la région qui allait devenir San Luis Potosí, une ville minière au nord du Mexique. Parmi eux, il y avait 44 enfants âgés de 1 à 13 ans qui quittèrent leur communauté d'origine et s'établirent dans ce lieu semi-aride, différent en tout point de leur lieu de naissance. Ces enfants tlaxcaltèques n'étaient pas les seuls à découvrir un monde étrange. Tout d'abord, il y avait les enfants Chichimec, ou plus spécifiquement les Guachichil pour la ville de San Luis Potosí en tant que telle, qui étaient les indigènes de la région de San Luis Potosí, et qui virent leurs parents changer de mode de vie complètement de manière drastique à cette époque-là, entre autres en abandonnant un mode de vie nomade pour celui de sédentaire, se convertissant aussi à l'agriculture et en acceptant de vivre avec des étrangers qui venaient du Sud. Ensuite, il y a des centaines d'autres enfants qui ont aussi migré à partir d'autres communautés mésoaméricaines pour s'établir avec leurs parents à San Luis Potosí. Le nombre de ces enfants-là est inconnu. En réalité, ils ont laissé relativement peu de traces de leur migration en tant que telle dans les documents, mais ils apparaissent quand même ici et là dans les documents judiciaires. Et surtout, leur présence est confirmée parce qu'il y a beaucoup d'actes de baptême à cette époque-là à San Luis Potosí. Et souvent, les enfants de migrants qui n'avaient pas été baptisés dans leur communauté d'origine le sont en arrivant à San Luis. Donc, ce sont justement ces enfants apparaissant dans les documents judiciaires qui m'ont amené à me poser certaines questions. Dans ma thèse, de manière plus générale, je tente de comprendre comment se pratiquèrent à San Luis Potosí entre 1591 et 1630 les relations entre les différents groupes amérindiens venus de plus de 130 communautés à travers toute la Mésoamérique. Donc, on parle d'ici environ une dizaine de langues différentes, pour environ, grosso modo, 2500 à 3000 Amérindiens qui vivent à San Luis Potosí. Ainsi, en plus d'appréhender les comportements des adultes, je me suis rendu compte que je devrais également aborder la question de l'enfance et de l'éducation dans ce milieu hautement diversifié. En effet, en plus d'être confrontés à diverses cultures d'origine et à plusieurs langues, les enfants vivaient dans des milieux très différents. Il y avait des communautés villageoises autour de la ville espagnole, en fait, qui n'était pas une ville à l'époque, qui était juste un village. Certains vivaient aussi dans les mines, dans des raffineries d'argent, dans des charbonneries, parce qu'il fallait faire le charbon à partir de bois, dans des élevages de bétail, sur les routes marchandes avec leurs parents, etc., etc. Chose qu'il faut pointer par contre ici, c'est qu'il n'y avait pas de travail forcé à San Luis Potosí. Les parents étaient payés pour faire leur travail. Les Espagnols établissaient des structures rigides sur leurs unités de travail, mais ne régissaient que très peu les va-et-vient généraux des Amérindiens. La vie générale au quotidien n'était pas régie comme ça, en tout cas pas à San Luis Potosí. Le tout donne une organisation sociale entre les Amérindiens relativement lâche et floue. La question que je me pose alors est celle de l'attachement des enfants qui ont migré à San Luis Potosí dans un contexte aussi flou, relâché, multiethnique, multiculturel. Comment ces enfants-là ont pu développer un sentiment d'appartenance? Comment leurs mécanismes d'identification se sont développés? Donc, de manière générale, mon argument, c'est que l'héritage culturel des parents semble pas avoir été transmis complètement aux enfants, seulement en partie, et que cet héritage-là a été remplacé par des nouvelles formes d'attachement qui sont plus liées à la vie quotidienne, au lieu d'habitation et au lieu de travail ou au travail en tant que tel, parce qu'ils apprennent, comme on va voir, à travailler relativement jeunes. Donc, San Luis Potosí et d'autres centres miniers en Nouvelle-Espagne sont souvent perçus et étudiés principalement comme des lieux de travail où la population était constituée surtout d'hommes adultes. En réalité, ce que j'ai découvert avec mes sources, c'est que la présence des femmes était très importante aussi, et donc de familles nucléaires et d'enfants. Par exemple, dans un recensement des Amérindiens qui travaillaient pour les Espagnols en 1603, près de 60% des personnes mentionnées étaient en couple. Si les enfants ne sont que rarement mentionnés dans les sources, on peut tout de même inférer à partir de cette statistique qu'ils formaient une partie importante de la population urbaine. Cependant, l'âge de l'enfance reste assez flou pour la période coloniale, en tout cas chez la population amérindienne. Certains auteurs tentent de déterminer l'enfance par l'âge du mariage, mais encore là, ils sont pas tous d'accord. Certains disent que l'âge moyen du mariage est autour de 12 ans, dont d'autres vont jusqu'à 25 ans. Donc, c'est assez difficile de déterminer là, c'est quoi exactement l'enfance. Pour les besoins de cette présentation-là, les cas que je vais présenter feront surtout référence à des individus de moins de 12 ans et ayant une relation avec leurs parents, enfants-parents. Donc, la majorité des enfants amérindiens de San Luis Potosí vivaient avec leurs parents, soit dans les communautés de l'agglomération, soit sur des unités de travail. Ces familles et leurs enfants apparaissent à l'occasion dans certains documents, notamment dans un procès contre un Amérindien appelé Mateo, qui fut condamné pour le meurtre de sa femme, Jeronima, en juillet 1595. L'une des principaux témoins était une Espagnole, Maria de Herrera, qui était en fait la femme du patron, donc en fait la patronne du couple. C'est important de le mentionner parce que c'était un des couples espagnols les plus puissants de la région. C'était un des premiers couples à arriver en tant que mineur à fonder une mine et à contrôler des Amérindiens. Donc, la patronne mentionne aux autorités que le couple avait 3 enfants, vivant tous dans la même maison, sur le terrain du mineur espagnol. Le plus vieux de ces enfants, qui s'appelait Sébastien, qui avait 11 ans, témoigna d'ailleurs au cours du procès et affirma que ses parents se seraient tous deux saoulés dans une taverne espagnole, au point où lui-même fut donné en garantie à l'Espagnol en tant que tel contre du textile et du vin. Dans le cas présent, c'est l'unité de travail des parents qui forme le cadre d'éducation des enfants. Donc, j'utilise cet exemple-là surtout pour essayer de comprendre dans quel cadre les enfants pouvaient habiter sur une unité de travail. Donc, le fait que les enfants vivaient avec leurs parents sur les unités de travail dans les communautés en général renseigne sur une transformation importante des modes d'identification entre le lieu d'origine et le lieu de destination. En effet, il a été démontré que la famille nucléaire n'était pas un concept important, ni même existant, disent certains, en Mésoamérique précolombienne. Au contraire, la maisonnée mésoaméricaine abritait des familles complexes, comprenant plusieurs générations, pouvait englober des tantes, des oncles, on pouvait retrouver une trentaine de personnes dans ces maisons-là, et un peu tout le monde était comme parent des enfants. La famille nucléaire en tant que telle n'existait pas. Donc le passage à la famille nucléaire ne fut pas exclusif à San Luis Potosí. En effet, il y a d'autres études, entre autres l'étude de Susan Kellogg, qui a démontré que l'importance de cette transformation-là dans la ville de Mexico au 16e et 17e siècle. Par contre, San Luis Potosí représente une spécificité la spécificité que l'immigration empêcha la continuation de certains liens familiaux élargis pendant la période coloniale. Les familles nucléaires étaient isolées de leurs origines et durent donc reconstruire de nouveaux réseaux basés sur les nouveaux contacts sociaux. Dans cette perspective, les enfants des migrants ne purent pas construire leur identité sur les bases des relations familiales élargies, donc avec tantes, oncles, grands-parents, etc., mais plutôt sur les rapports de travail élaborés par leurs parents ou sur les rapports de cohabitation dans les communautés nouvellement créées. Je n'élimine pas complètement le facteur ethnique dans la création des réseaux sociaux, en partie parce que l'utilisation de langues spécifiques comme étant des référents culturels passés. En partie parce que l'utilisation de langues spécifiques des référents culturels passés par l'éducation parentale ou l'expérience des inégalités dans la hiérarchie ethnique peuvent avoir influencé la création des liens interpersonnels des enfants. C'est-à-dire que entre les Amérindiens, être Chichimec ou Tlaxcaltec ou Nawa, etc., n'avait pas toute la même signification. Il y avait une hiérarchie entre ces groupes ethniques-là. Donc la langue qu'on parle peut avoir une répercussion sur l'appartenance des individus. Par exemple, au cours d'un témoignage dans un procès criminel en 1595, l'infériorité ethnique est nettement imposée à un jeune Guachichil. Donc, les Guachichil, je vous rappelle, qui étaient les semi-nomades qui habitaient la région avant, donc perçus comme étant une classe ethnique inférieure. Ce jeune Guachichil qui avait environ 12 ans, qui s'appelait Dagueyo, témoignait dans un procès pour meurtre. Ce qu'il dit, par contre, ce qui est intéressant dans ce témoignage-là, c'est qu'il dit que le meurtrier en tant que tel, qui est un Mexicain, un Nawa, l'avait battu et l'utilisait dans son travail, l'exploitait dans son travail. Donc ici, on voit une jeune personne, un jeune homme de 12 ans, donc moi je considère que c'est un enfant, donc, qui très tôt vit dans un contexte où il perçoit cette différence-là, cette hiérarchie ethnique-là, de manière assez difficile. Cependant, au quotidien, la plupart des relations entre les enfants se faisaient dans des lieux multiethniques, multilinguistiques, où cette hiérarchie ethnique semble avoir eu moins de répercussions que d'autres facteurs, tels que les compétences professionnelles, par exemple, la classe, qui est un concept qui commence à se développer à l'époque avec la mise en place d'industries hispaniques, et la cohabitation sur une longue période. Pour mieux comprendre cette affirmation, il faut porter attention aux comportements maritaux des immigrants de deuxième génération, c'est-à-dire aux individus qui sont arrivés enfants à San Luis Potosí et qui s'y sont mariés après. Donc là, je fais une petite extrapolation dans le temps plus tard. Tout d'abord, il y a eu une diminution des mariages entre individus émanant des mêmes groupes culturels au cours des décennies. Puis il y a eu une augmentation des relations entre individus d'origine culturelle différente dans les années 1620. Donc, on voit que les enfants qui ont migré dans les fin 16e siècle, début 17e siècle, ont moins la même tendance que leurs parents de se marier dans les mêmes groupes ethniques. Ils sont plus enclins à se marier, à fonder des familles multiculturelles, si on veut. Donc, ces dernières sont particulièrement intéressantes. J'ai sauté une ligne. OK. Finalement aussi, ce qui est intéressant, c'est qu'il y a une augmentation des relations inconnues, des relations ethniques qui sont inconnues. Donc, ce qui arrive en fait, c'est que les prêtres qui écrivent dans les sources n'écrivent plus l'origine des enfants, mais écrivent plutôt dans quel lieu ils habitent à San Luis Potosí. Et ça, c'est significatif parce que ce sont les enfants eux-mêmes qui vont dire « Ok, j'habite dans tel quartier, dans tel quartier, dans tel quartier ». Et puis, on remarque qu'ils ont tendance, au lieu de s'unir par origine, ils vont s'unir par lieux d'habitation à San Luis Potosí. D'ailleurs aussi, à la même époque, on voit de plus en plus d'enfants qui travaillent pour le même patron, qui vont commencer à développer des liens entre eux et qui vont plus tard se marier, donc dans les années 1620. Voilà. Pour comprendre ce phénomène, il faut se remettre dans le contexte de la vie quotidienne. La population amérindienne de l'agglomération comptait des milliers d'individus, mais ils étaient divisés en 8 communautés et en plusieurs dizaines d'unités de travail. Dans chaque communauté ou sur chaque lieu de travail, les enfants avaient donc la possibilité de connaître la plupart des autres enfants de leur âge, d'autant plus qu'ils participaient aux activités quotidiennes qui elles-mêmes se pratiquaient en groupe. Par exemple, un document mentionne qu'un endroit particulier de la rivière Santiago, à San Luis Potosí, était privilégié par les Amérindiennes qui allaient souvent avec leurs enfants pour, par exemple, laver les vêtements. Donc, ils allaient là en groupe. De plus, la vente de la production maraîchère ou de viande s'effectuait dans des lieux déterminés, donc les marchés, les boucheries, etc. Les lieux de travail, surtout ceux formés de plusieurs dizaines de travailleurs, étaient organisés comme des unités de production quasi autosuffisantes. Les enfants qui y vivaient pouvaient passer plusieurs journées sans en sortir. Dans ces lieux, les familles nucléaires avaient habituellement une pièce à elles où elles pouvaient dormir, mais elles prenaient leur repas avec toutes les autres familles dans une grande salle commune. Ainsi, les enfants de ces lieux de travail étaient élevés en milieu presque clos et développaient de fortes relations entre eux. 2 minutes? Aïe, 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 OK. Basées sur le quotidien et sur l'appartenance au lieu de travail, plutôt que sur l'origine ethnique. OK, donc. OK. Au cours de mes recherches, j'ai marqué qu'une autre forme d'identification importante parmi les Amérindiens de San Luis Potosí, qui était liée aux compétences et aux techniques de travail et au développement de catégories sociales basées plutôt sur la classe, c'est-à-dire sur les moyens de production. Ainsi, par exemple, les artisans, les raffineurs d'argent, les travailleurs non qualifiés, entre autres, développèrent des liens par compétences, tout en développant une compétition quant au statut social de chacun de ces groupes-là. OK, je vais faire ça vite. Dans un monde où l'enfance était beaucoup plus courte qu'aujourd'hui, où l'acquisition des aptitudes nécessaires à poursuivre le travail entrepris par les parents ne fait s'effectuer tôt, l'apparition de ce mode d'identification a eu un impact certain sur les enfants amérindiens dans la mesure où les fils étaient fortement incités, voire obligés par leur père, de développer tôt les compétences liées à une classe sociale spécifique. Ce fut le cas, par exemple, d'un garçon qui s'appelait Miguel, d'origine Texcoca, qui, dès 8 ans, fut amené par son père devant les autorités de San Luis Potosí afin qu'il devienne apprenti tailleur chez un Espagnol pour une période de 4 ans. Ces jeunes apprentis amérindiens devaient tous vivre pour toute la période de leur apprentissage chez leur maître espagnol dans le quartier central de San Luis Potosí. Dans la plupart de ces ateliers, les apprentis et les travailleurs étaient de multiples origines et parlaient diverses langues. Nos sources indiquent que, plutôt que d'opérer une distinction en groupes linguistiques, ces groupes formaient des unités pluriethniques au sein desquelles l'appartenance devenait forte au point où le groupe pouvait venir à la défense d'un individu qui se faisait attaquer par un autre groupe. Et donc, en somme, j'ai vraiment vu dans mes sources des compétitions plutôt basées sur les compétences des individus. Donc, un groupe d'artisans ensemble, un groupe de raffineurs ensemble ou des gens avec peu de qualifications, mais encore qui travaillent ensemble, donc qui se forment un groupe ensemble. Donc, tout ça pour dire, en conclusion, que les enfants qui migrèrent à San Luis Potosí furent élevés dans un contexte tout à fait différent de celui de leur lieu d'origine. La plupart vécurent dans un contexte multiculturel où de nouvelles formes de relations sociales étaient en développement. Si l'héritage culturel des parents ne semble que peu avoir été transmis, de nouveaux facteurs relationnels se sont établis. En premier lieu, le lieu de vie, les relations au quotidien et le travail. Merci.
So, hi everyone. I'm really happy to be here, and I hope that my presentation will complement the presentation given by Laurent, because I think it will illustrate the different path that colonization took in colonial Latin America. While his discussion of children in Latin America will take place in a time where ethnic groups and different indigenous populations are trying to adapt to a new religion, a new language that is imposed to them by these new people that are trying to convert them and populate the land. My presentation will be in the second half of the 18th century. And the second half of the 18th century is different because it's a time where, for my area of study, which is the Audiencia of Quito, which, for your information, is pretty similar to a country called Ecuador today. What is interesting about it is that the majority of the population is mestizo, is half indigenous and half white, or half black and half white, and have mixed identities. So they are considered in a different category, which is called the castas. And the castas in Ecuador is very different from Mexico. If you look at the castas in Mexico, there are 17 categories of name that you can be called. Looking at who's your grandmother, what's the ethnicity of your father, and how the mix operates in your ancestry. Whereas in Ecuador, there's really 3 categories that you can be. You are black, you are indigenous, or you are white. And the in-betweens are just called castas. They don't have rankings. They're just mixed, and the state doesn't really know what to do with them because they are not, like the indigenous people, taxpayers, and they are not like the white people, patriarchs, and they are not like the black people, slaves. So they have this identity, whereas nobody really knows what to do with them. So if you study juvenile delinquency in that period, that's really significant because you will see a lot of castas, a lot of offenders which are in this category. So let me show you. First of all, I'm going to start with an example. In 1764, a young man named Lázaro Lastra was accused of sacrilege for stealing the clothing of 2 saint statues from a church in Barbacoas, which is a city that would be today in Colombia, but at the time was part of Quito. Lázaro Lastra didn't know his age, but he claimed to be 20 or 22 years old. Lázaro Lastra was a minor because under 25 years old in this period, you were considered to be a minor. To make up for the accused's lack of protection in the patriarchal system, if you're a minor, you're entitled for a defender of the minor. So a court-appointed type of lawyer, someone who knows the law, to represent him. This defender pointed out that his client, as a minor, was to be considered poor and vulnerable because of his age in order to get a penalty that would be reduced. The defender also explained that anyone under 25 should be given, and I quote, the benefit of the doubt, even when he had confessed a crime, if this confession had taken place without a guardian to advise him. As we can see, the colonial Spanish state decided to assume a paternal role and offer the services of a Spanish man, presumably a white man, to protect someone in vulnerable state, a minor, who has a minority status, which could also include widows, which could also include indigenous people. Because in this time, indigenous people were considered minor, even if they were 45 years old. They were assumed to be less reasonable by nature and were entitled to this title. Sometimes they are called niños con barbas, which means children with beard, because they were always under patriarchal status. But Lazaro Lastra here is presumably black, so he has to claim the minority status. So there is a category called menor de edad. It's a racial concept, and depending on your race, you can be entitled to be a minor for life, or under 25 if you're outside of this realm. If you're a woman, it depends on your status. A woman is presumed to be a minor if she's under 25, but I have proven in my thesis that there are women of 35 years old who have to go to court in order to gain their independence. So it's a little bit more complicated for women. They can be in charge of a family if they are widows and can be have the majority status, but it's not granted automatically. And when you are a minor, you can have a protector or a defender if you're accused of something. And if you're indigenous, you have someone called the protector de naturales, which is a lawyer appointed for you who is supposed to know a little bit your language and help you if you go to court. So the case of Lazaro Lastra ends badly. So in December 25, 1765, Lazaro Lastra was executed for robbing the church. This case shows that although it was possible to use age and innocence as a legal argument to justify a crime, minor age alone did not guarantee that the court will be lenient, especially in a colonial society where the concepts of honor, race, and social status, gender, and age were always taken into account when identifying those responsible of a crime and choosing the appropriate punishment. For instance, a white person could not receive death penalty, whereas an indigenous person could. So it depended on who you were in order for the court to decide what kind of a punishment you deserved, depending on your honor, race, social status, gender, and age. Despite having pleaded that his naive client had been infected by malice surrounding him, Lazaro's defender was unable to make the court forget his scandalous behavior. By positioning itself as a substitute father for a multitude of young people without any fatherly protection, the colonial state aimed not only to protect vulnerable minors from abuse and crime, but also to punish them when necessary. As we shall see in the second half of the 18th century, the courts were even more ambivalent towards young offenders, because these courts were torn between a mission to protect the poor and the defenseless, but they also wanted to maintain law and order. So, the period that I study more specifically in the history of Latin America is called the Bourbon Reform. And the Bourbon Reform starts when the leaders of Spain are influenced by the French family, the Bourbon, and the King of Spain is from that same family. And the Bourbon states will try around 1760 to impose more control of Spain in Latin America. And one of the things that they will do is try to repress crime. And crime against minors in particular, especially young children. So there are unprecedented campaigns against young offenders. These young offenders were targeted more than ever by the state because they had to be protected from themselves, from their own impulses and desire, their laziness, and their sexuality. Unbridled sexuality. The social reforms made by the Bourbons affected the type of crimes deemed worthy of repression. They were especially concerned with sexual crimes. Witnesses were not all equal when they appeared in front of the judges on the Audiencia de Quito because their race, family, and social status were important when delivering a sentence. So as you can imagine, when I talk about sexuality being repressed, I'm talking more about women. Men are not targeted as much. In the second half of the 18th century, there were significant changes in the way that vice and crime were perceived by the Spanish and colonial authorities. The Bourbon social reforms aimed to control every aspect of social, cultural, political, and religious lives of the subjects of the King of Spain. By reducing the powers of the Catholic Church, who had been the traditional watchdogs of public and domestic morality, the Bourbons gave the state the mandate to discipline the people. So, the reformers tried to control the street. hygiene, public gatherings. They created a police patrols in the street. In Quito, they cracked down against various forms of entertainment, such as the carnival and cockfights, which are still two problems in Ecuador up to this day that the government is concerned with. During this period of rapid urbanization, they wanted to apply bourgeois behavioral norms by force. They tried to create separate public spaces for respectable people that could not be infiltrated by common people. So, it was in the field of vice and delinquency repression, especially in cities, that the Bourbon social project was applied more systematically. So offenses that were tolerated in the time, for instance, Laurent talked about, begging was not a crime, public intoxication, family disputes, fornication, sexual intercourse. The state didn't care about that, and probably you didn't see a lot of trials about that, whereas I was able to read trials about bestiality, homosexuality, because the state cared about these things and implemented a repression. So let me show you crimes per decade. Youth were especially bothersome for public servants who wanted to control every dark corner of the city streets. So if you look at the criminal holdings of Quito's National Archives, they show the proliferation of prosecutions, many of these involving children and teenagers. So I've only looked at cases where there was evidence that a youth was involved in it, or a crime against a youth was perpetrated. My goal was to better understand the impact of the Bourbon social reforms on the repression of crime. With this in mind, my study covered holdings from 1700 to the end of the 18th century. Through the study of 88 criminal cases involving minors, we were able to see markedly more severe sentences handed down to minors accused of sex crimes, such as living with someone you're not married to, incest, adultery, and homosexuality. The same goes for prosecution of all types of sex crimes against young girls. So this hardening is really specifically looked into sex crimes. So I'm going to show you one of the biggest limit of my study is that most cases originate from the city of Quito, the capital, because the colonial state tried to harden its policies, but it was really located in Quito. The police didn't really go that much in the countryside and behind. So 51% of the crimes that I found in the archives were related to events that took place in the surroundings of the capital city. Now, the types of crime. So, one crime that stands out before 1760, they're not really there, and they appear suddenly after 1760, is the sexual offense. So the Bourbon reformers were particularly interested in morality. The number of murder, aggression, and theft is stable in the first half and the second half of the 17th century. However, the sexual crimes are on the rise. For the accused, the number goes from 1 to 7 cases. And the victims, they will go from 10 to 25 cases. So it's even easier if you're being raped to have the state worry about it. Most crimes tried under the label sexual crime is that of debauchery, which is the act of, I quote, deflowering an honest woman. So you could rape someone that's a slave, and that's not considered rape because she's not honest. You need honor in order to be considered an honorable woman, meaning you have to be someone that has some value on the market of marriage in order to have that. Yeah. So the term is usually, rape is usually used when a young woman has a relationship with a man without the consent of her parents, or when the marriage promise was broken. But I found 4 cases of estupro con violencia, which means a rape with violence, and all of these 4 crimes involve young indigenous women girls under the age of 10. The law considered that violence was aggravating the rape. So there's a big difference with a rape associated with seduction. So if you seduce an honorable woman, it's a different crime than if you rape someone that's a minor. But I haven't found any cases of rape involving girls above 14 years old. Above 14 years old, there's presumably you have not been raped. You have to be a young child to say that. I'm gonna look at also the race of people accused of crime. So before 1760, because the colonial state is very involved in the cities, most people accused of crime are labeled as white. And black people, they don't come up very often because it's their master that's supposed to be able to control their slaves. So there's not always interference of the court in there. Indigenous people, often these matters are settled within the community. So it's the mestizos that's an interesting category because they're these people that we don't know what race they have. And it's pretty average, but if we look after 1760, most people are listed as unknown. So there's a big change in who will be prosecuted. And it's not that the white commit less crime, it's that there are more crimes overall, so these people are targeted. These unknown people are targeted specifically by the state, in my opinion. Yeah. So I don't have a lot of time. Yeah, I'm gonna... so the punishment that they receive will also become different. So before 1760, it was really rare to receive the capital punishment for a crime against a minor. But after 1760, the one that's really on the rise is forced labor. So the state, one of the incentives that they have in going after juvenile delinquency is that they can get free laborers. Because now the state has opened new monopolies, for example, tobacco factory operated by the state. So if you can find young offenders and condemn them to forced labor, you have someone that's working for free. So that's something that I found. It's also very interesting. And Table 8, punishment for a crime against a minor, the same thing. It's forced labor, which was absent before 1760. So the state is also looking not only for preserving the law, but also for workers. So my conclusion, in the second half of the 17th century, the courts of Quito changed completely their discourse on minority. The state used to define itself as a protector of the poor and the minors. So the minors were part of the poor category, the defenseless category. Now it became centered on the necessity for the state to educate the youth. This was not to be done through the school system only, even though the state did open schools and get more involved into the schools, but also through the law, placing morality and productivity as their top priorities, and thus going against people for being drunk or for being beggars or for being vagrant instead of being productive. So that's the conclusion.
So I guess we'll cross the ocean to Africa now and move forward about 150 years, almost 200 years. But I think there's a lot of interesting contrasts and similarities between our presentations, which should be good. In the summer of 1956, a series of allegations detailing the incarceration of children and young people as a result of alleged crimes relating to the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya rocked the British House of Commons. Opposition MPs were especially outraged by the possibility that, quote, 3 little girls had been sentenced to prison. My talk today will examine the debates and investigations regarding the legal ages of these 3 female prisoners. The definition of a legal age became a crucial component in dealing with issues relating to children and young people in colonial Africa. But as I think this case demonstrates, this was never an easy task for colonial officials. While childhood may be a feature common to all societies, there are fundamental differences in the ways each separates the category of children from adult. And the way these stages are conceptualized and experienced are heavily mediated by cultural and social constructions. I'd like to tentatively suggest that this case study demonstrates how metropolitan British social policy regarding children was transferred to the colonial environment, where it merged with the local social attitudes to create a hybrid set of policies and practices. But I'd also, in turn, like to suggest the way ideas concerning local practices themselves travel back to the metropole. And before I get into my discussion, I'd like to make the note that when I use the term circumcision, that's reflecting when it's used in primary sources, and I'll use the term female genital cutting. By the early 1950s, frustrations with discriminatory policies turned violent in the central Kenyan highlands, where long-standing grievances over landlessness led to what we call the Mau Mau Uprising. Although impoverished Kikuyu held the colonial government responsible for this problem, they took their aggression out on its local proxies, chiefs, businessmen, and Christian converts, for unfairly procuring land. The urban unemployed, the dispossessed, squatters, and poor peasants who lost land to politically connected members of their lineage bound themselves together with powerful oaths that swore their commitment to restoring social justice. The colonial government, in turn to this violence, declared a state of emergency in 1952 that lasted until 1960. Faced with a vast Kikuyu population that he either had voluntarily taken the oath or had been intimidated to take it, the colonial regime resorted to mass detentions in addition to a military response. Screening teams made up of district officers and politically reliable loyalists systematically worked their way through schools, churches, villages, and African locations in the capital of Nairobi to root out what they called Mau Mau's passive wing. Colonial authorities arrested anyone even suspected of taking an oath and turned their land over to loyalists. So what this means is that under the state of emergency, the government returned over 100,000 Kikuyu, Embu, and Meru living on settler farms and in Nairobi to their native districts, placed over 80,000 others in detention camps, and forced over 1 million men, women, and children to live in heavily fortified and guarded villages, with the goal of preventing them from providing supplies and support to the rebels living in the forest. But reports of the ill treatment of prisoners and horrifying conditions in these prisons and camps made headlines across Britain. The Conservative government continually fought off accusations of brutality, widespread suffering, and neglect due to their response to Mau Mau. On the floor of the House of Commons, the opposition Labour Party continually pushed Alan Lennox Boyd, the Secretary of State for the Colonies, on allegations of atrocities in the camps, people detained without trial, the rate of release, and the day-to-day operation of camps and villages. In turn, Lennox Boyd claimed that poor treatment or atrocities were indeed deplorable, but were isolated incidents. He also claimed that they needed to be understood in the context of the perceived brutality of the event. Charges leveled by a former rehabilitation officer, Eileen Fletcher, in the press, and a pamphlet called The Truth About Kenya, were more specific and extensive concerning brutalities and breaches of law in the camps. One of the most damning allegations Fletcher brought forward, and one that appears to have captured the attention of the Labour Party, centered on 3 cases of female prisoners under the age of 14 held at Kamati prison camp. As many MPs noted during debates on the subject, this was in direct violation of Kenya's juvenile ordinance, which declared it illegal to imprison any child under the age of 14. Perhaps not surprisingly then, Fletcher's accusations concerning these female prisoners and their treatment caused a great deal of controversy. 3 cases were subsequently reinvestigated in order to determine the legal age of each prisoner. And as I will demonstrate, these cases reveal the incredible difficulty and inconsistencies in recording legal ages. The first prisoner, and I should mention that I've had a really difficult time tracking down the names of the prisoners, I've only ever seen them referenced by their number, pled guilty to taking illegal oaths and was sentenced to 7 years imprisonment. Her age was given on the charge sheet at her initial trial as an adult. It was entered on the prison record as 18. And then, in the words of the colonial secretary, was altered by some persons unknown to 11. After an investigation in June of 1956, a British medical officer concluded her age as then being 15 and a half, meaning she would have been nearly 14 at the time of her conviction. Additionally, quote, 3 Kikuyu women of equivalent standing to tribal elders determined her age to then be 18 and a half, that is, 16 and a half on conviction. So as we see, there's clearly several inconsistencies in this prisoner's age. The second case centered on a prisoner who was convicted on the capital charge of consorting with an armed person, and the prison record sheet from her initial trial listed her age to be 12. However, the investigations of 1956 ascertained her age to then be 18, meaning she would have been 16 on conviction. Similarly, the third prisoner, who was also convicted of consorting with an armed person, was given an indeterminate length for her prison sentence. At the time of her trial, her age was listed as 12 and a half. In 1956, a medical officer concluded her age to then be 15 and a half, or 13 and a half on conviction. The panel of Kikuyu women indicated that they believed her age to be 20 or 18 when she was convicted. Presented with these stark variations, the Labour Party suggested a further impartial investigation. This never came to pass, despite the colonial secretary's recognition, quote, there is something a little unsatisfactory in the method of keeping the various ages of juveniles who come before the court, end quote. Eileen Fletcher's allegations were routinely dismissed, with Lennox Boyd asserting her claims were based on hearsay, partisan opinion, and personal prejudice, and they were nothing more, in his opinion, than a series of fresh lies and distortions. However, as a result of her assertions concerning the ill treatment of other prisoners, the colonial government issued a special report on the administration of prisons and detention camps in Kenya. While acknowledging that many camps were hastily constructed and ill-supplied, the report was largely self-congratulatory concerning the so-called rehabilitation of Mau Mau adherents. It did admit that, quote, the position with regard to female juveniles is more complicated, end quote. In the eyes of the government, quote, prior to the emergency, there was never any need for an approved school for girls. Such few cases, when they did arise from time to time, were dealt with either by probation or committal to the care of missionaries or similar societies. Indeed, the report goes on to state, quote, the extent of female crime, both adult and juvenile, before the emergency presented no problem. However, the declaration of the state of emergency ensured the disposal of females, both young and old, convicted and detained for Mau Mau offenses became a serious matter, end quote. When questioned on the length and severity of their sentences, the colonial secretary urged the House of Commons to remember, some of these youthful prisoners have a horrifying maturity in crime. They have been brutalized by months of association with Mau Mau in the forests, and we have, unhappily, considerable evidence of their general debasement and their persistent attempts to incite others to mutiny. Tellingly, he claimed, until the Mau Mau tragedy is completely cleared up, it is essential not to lose sight of the fact that some of the people of whom we are talking as if they are juveniles in the strict sense of the word have themselves played a terrifying role in the Mau Mau conspiracy, end quote. This discovery of female crime, whether juvenile or adult, echoes what historians have described as a British discovery of juvenile delinquency in the 1930s in colonial Africa. This work establishes that the disruptive and uneven opportunities of social and economic change seem to encourage new forms of youthly defiance and create juvenile delinquents. Colonial governments intervened to impose new legally defined categories of juveniles for the first time, and an expansion of child and youth welfare now forced the colonial government in various British colonies to frame laws with specific but varying age limits and to create or expand age-specific institutions. In Kenya, juvenile offenders were the subjects of almost no official interest until the 1930s, when a series of official reports was commissioned and legislation was enacted that attempted to modernize the management of juvenile offenders in keeping with current metropolitan policy. While previously colonial courts had made a more rough and ready distinction between children and adults, this expansion of child and youth welfare ensured that governments now framed laws with specific but varying age limits. So in this case, that a child would be under the age of 14 and a young person would have been in between the age of 14 and 17. And they also created or expanded age-specific institutions to cope with the influx of juvenile offenders the enforcement of such laws created. But as I think this case study demonstrates, it may have been one thing to create and expand laws with specific age limits, but quite another to actually establish the legal age of children and young people in order to enforce these laws. And this would prove especially complicated in African societies that did not use biological, chronological, or Christian teleological factors to determine age, but rather relied on social criteria to distinguish children from adults. And for the Kikuyu of Kenya, one of the most significant demarcations of age was the practice of initiation, or arua. Representing the transition from childhood to adulthood, this practice was one of the central cultural institutions in indigenous constructions of not only age, but identity and gender in pre-colonial and colonial Kenya. The practice of male and female initiation, including genital cutting, was deeply embedded in the social, political, and educational institutions of these communities. These rites created cohesion among peers and defined individual obligations to the community. And as I've mentioned, as this practice represents the transition from childhood to adulthood, uninitiated individuals were generally always considered children in the eyes of their communities, regardless of an age that might have been determined by a biological or a Christian-based chronological order of time. And although various biomedical tests were devised to determine the age of male offenders, these tests ranged from searching from armpit hair in the 1920s to performing x-rays of molars and bones in the 1950s. During the debates about the female prisoners, the colonial secretary indicated, quote, "It would be quite unwise to place exclusive reliance on medical evidence," end quote. When pushed to ensure that the ages of female prisoners would be ascertained by medical examinations, he replied, "Research into the problem of determining the age of an African juvenile has so far disclosed no method of making an exact determination by medical examination." He assured the House that examination of all female prisoners now at Kamati by a panel of 3 Kikuyu women equivalent to tribal elders has confirmed that all were of or over the age of 14 and of adult tribal age groups when sentenced. Thus, in the eyes of the colonial secretary, the case was settled. The judgment of Kikuyu female elders was favored over medical investigations. The prisoners were not girls, but women, because they had been initiated, and as such, they stayed at Kamati prison. But this emphasis on their initiation must be understood alongside the continual efforts of some colonial authorities, missionaries, and British activists to condemn and ban the practice of female initiation in Kenya. During the same year as this case study, Lynn Thomas has established that a group of young girls practiced initiation on themselves and were subject to really strict governmental fines and punishment. So I think this demonstrates that the colonial states' views, policies, and actions were at times highly contradictory. On the one hand, in London, the colonial secretary upheld the use of circumcision or initiation to determine the age of offenders. On the others, individuals on the ground who were involved in rituals in rural Kenya were prosecuted for the. And by way of conclusion, I'd like to suggest that this case really demonstrates how age-based legal distinctions that may have been drawn between children and adults in Britain become more fuzzy and indistinct in Kenya. Perhaps an example of a stutter between metropolitan policy and colonial practice. But I really think it also hints at the ways indigenous practices, in this case, the use of initiation as a way to mark age, can also inform metropolitan decisions and policies. While this case demonstrates some of the clear inconsistencies in recording legal ages, It also hints at the ways the Mau Mau uprising may have redefined categories of childhood and youth in the 1950s. So good afternoon now, everybody. So today I will be talking to you about nation building with care, bringing child health to Africa. And I'm going to be talking about child-oriented development initiatives of the Ugandan government and the British Red Cross Society in the 1950s and the 1960s. And in the context of decolonization, previous colonial powers, new national governments, and international organizations active in Africa emphasized child welfare as crucial to national welfare and nation building. The actors I'm discussing today came from outside of Africa and contributed to this dialogue of national well-being and progress, thus laying the foundations of much of the international development work that is being carried out today. First, I will discuss Hebe Welburn, who is in the slide on your left, a child welfare district officer in Mengo district, Uganda, and then I will link her efforts to the work of that of the British Red Cross Society in the Gold Coast. And you can see Lady Limerick, who is the vice president of the British Red Cross from 1946 to 1963, which actually coincides with Hebe Welburn's time in Uganda. Ultimately, this paper will allow how child health and mothering was integral to development initiatives. When I interviewed Hebe Welburn, who you can see in the picture on the bottom, in her home in Bristol in England last year, she was nearing her 90th birthday. Had I not been there to interview her about her experience in Uganda as a doctor in the mid-20th century, I would never have known her age, as her memories were vivid, her opinions strong, and her energy vigorous. Welburn was born on August 28, 1922 in Oundle, central England. During the Second World War, she completed a 4-year course in medicine, graduating from the University of Birmingham in 1944. 2 years later, her husband, Fred, was called to Uganda as a chaplain and tutor in physics at Makerere University, and thus she accompanied him under the auspices of the London-based Church Missionary Society as a doctor working at Mengo Hospital. And there, for those of you who don't know African geography that well, you can see Uganda is part of East Africa. Fred and Hebe remained in Uganda from 1946 to 1963. But 3 years after her arrival, Welburn left the Church Missionary Society to work as a government health officer for schools and child welfare, which she did until 1962. Welburn's experience in Uganda made her an expert in the field of tropical pediatrics, allowing her to collaborate with other experts in the field, write articles for medical journals, and publish books on child care and hygiene for African parents. One of Welburn's primary tasks as the Child Welfare District Officer in Mengo District was the running of experimental child welfare units. These were mobile pediatric clinics which not only provided treatment to sick children, but were used as centers for health education, training of medical students, nurses, and various auxiliaries, and research into the social background of malnutrition and social factors in health education. Through these mobile clinics, Welburn was able to reach out to women in rural areas, women who would otherwise not have been able to seek medical assistance for their sick children. However, Welburn's underlying philosophy for these clinics was that medicine was subordinate to teaching. Hence, while medical examinations, including the weighing and measuring of children, which you can see in the upper picture there, and the distribution of medicine for small ills, such as thrush, ringworm, coughing, and septic sores, etc., were important aspects of the clinic, and then you can see medicine being given out there as well. So was the teaching of breastfeeding and hygienic weaning practices to ward off the dangers of formula misuse, the increase of caloric value in local foods through improved cooking practices, providing mothers with cooking demonstrations, and you can see a demonstration there at the bottom, and the general protection against disease, so focusing on home hygiene and proper latrine use, for example. Now, these things were taught through practical demonstrations using real mothers and babies, and posters, flannel boards, and sometimes even films, although Welburn thought that these were often more glamorous than instructive. While Welburn oversaw the medical aspects of the clinic, much of the teaching was carried out by Ugandans. As you can see in the slide, most of these people are Ugandan, presumably. Welburn observed that Africans, even with little training, are more effective than European helpers who have no direct experience of African attitudes and living conditions. Welborn's guiding principle in her medical work in Uganda was mother love, as she called it in our interview. This holistic approach to child welfare emphasized the education of mothers within a changing, modernizing environment, and is clearly expressed in her 1966 book, A First Book of Child Care for African Parents. The book makes clear that Welborn believed it was the modernization of Uganda that was negatively impacting family life, and hence the health of children, not a lack of maternal instinct or love, which many were ascribing to African mothers at the time. Her romanticization of tribal life, of the old days as she called it, emphasizes this, and thus her manual comes across as a tool for African parents, especially young mothers, to cope with change. In this way, Welborn sought to make Uganda's uncertain future a little more secure. She held that nutrition and health were modern concepts that needed to be taught to Africans, especially the women, as they could no longer depend on tribal customs. This knowledge would ensure that healthy children became healthy adults, thus guaranteeing a healthy future generation. The book covers topics usual for ante and postnatal care: birthing, breastfeeding, weaning, nutrition, and sanitation, but what is striking in this manual, as compared to those produced by the British Red Cross, is Welborn's emphasis on mother love, the old days, relationships, and play. For example, Welborn identified deprivation of maternal care as a common cause of illness among infants in some parts of Africa, and the start of an uprooted and wayward life. Writing about her experience with the Baganda and the area around Kampala, this discussion of child-mother separation is not surprising, as many women went into the city to work, leaving their children in distant villages with relatives. Welborn also remarked that the advent of Western-style schooling, traditional ways of learning were slowly taking the back seat, negatively impacting toddlers. Rising school enrollment meant that infants and toddlers were increasingly left on their own, as the older children of their family and neighbors attended schools and had to work harder to complete their chores. To combat this, Welborn recommended nursery schools which encouraged children to play, as playing strengthened children's bodies and taught them to think, express how they feel, and play with other children. Welborn wrote that a good nursery is one which helps children to prepare through play for school and for life in the modern, changing world. This is much more important than simply trying to teach children to read and write, end quote. And here you can see some toys that African children make, and also children playing at one of the clinics. With this in mind, Welborn's child welfare clinics always carry toys or other playful materials alongside medical equipment in order to engage the minds and bodies of infants and toddlers as they were waiting for their mothers. Through such observations and conclusions, Welborn offers important insights into the changing nature of childhood and hence child welfare during Uganda's transition from a protectorate to independence. Ultimately, through her emphasis on relationships, health, and play, Welborn's written and practical work centered on re-establishing relationships, most especially motherhood, as central to a child's well-being in a changing environment. While Welborn's clinics were government-run, they were not operating in isolation. In 1956, in an academic article describing these very clinics, Welborn wrote, "During the past few years, Africans in Uganda have been increasingly aware of the importance of good methods of childcare and infant feeding. The demand for advice and instruction in these matters is widespread. Attendance at child welfare clinics is increasing steadily. A total of 7,719 children attended our child welfare clinics in 1954 in Mengo district. The demand for child welfare clinic facilities cannot be met by the existing resources of the Uganda Medical Department. A great deal can be done, and has already started, by cooperation with voluntary bodies, such as the Red Cross. By this means, voluntary helpers can be enlisted and trained to run medical clinics or classes of their own." And here you can see Hebe actually collaborating with a Red Cross nurse. The fact that the Red Cross is mentioned here is not surprising, as the British Red Cross Society, which I from now on will call the Red Cross, was very active in Britain's possessions, especially within the period around decolonization. The Red Cross framed good health as an act of responsible citizenship, which led it to challenge men, women, and youth to incorporate health in the form of personal practice, good mothering, and community service into their daily lives. This is true for much of British Red Cross's work throughout Africa. While I admit that there was much regional difference in the activities of the Red Cross, the fact that its work was overseen by the headquarters in London, particularly the desk of the Overseas Department, and that staff was moved around the different branches, allows some general conclusions to be made, and these are most aptly demonstrated by the activities of the Red Cross's Gold Coast branch, And then here you can see that the Gold Coast takes us all the way over to West Africa. Interestingly, the Gold Coast branch of the British Red Cross Society evolved out of the Gold Coast-based League for Maternal and Child Welfare, which was established in 1929. Similar to Welborn's work as a district medical officer, central to the Gold Coast Red Cross's branch work were traveling maternal health clinics exemplified in this image. And there you can see a model. In this picture, we see a model of a maternal and child welfare clinic visiting a presumably remote village in the Gold Coast. This model was likely made in Britain in the 1940s as part of a set of small display cases that were exhibited throughout the UK in the late 1940s and the 1950s. The fact that the designers of the exhibition chose a mobile maternal and child welfare clinic to be the sole representative of their overseas initiatives does not strike me as a coincidence, as this was central to the work of the Gold Coast branch of the Red Cross. What is striking about this model, however, is the fact there are no white people present in it. While it represents the work of the Red Cross, it demonstrates how black people, presumably Gold Coast residents, contributed to community health through the clinic. At least this is what the maker of the model wanted people in Britain to see. Yet this participation is confirmed by archival evidence. A brief historical account written by an anonymous Red Cross enthusiast, most likely an employee, on the eve of Ghanaian independence in 1957 emphasizes this by stating, "There were mobile clinics for the rural areas, and these were manned entirely by African-trained staff. This service, pioneered by the Red Cross and maintained by them for several years, is now being taken over by the government." As this demonstrates, local participation was central to Red Cross initiatives within the colonies. This is not surprising, as the very structure of the organization has always made it dependent on volunteers. And perhaps this idea that the creator of the model wanted to advance is this participation. But what is noteworthy here is that while both child welfare clinics in the Gold Coast and Uganda emphasized African participation, in the case of the Gold Coast, the clinics were the initiative of a voluntary body, whereas in Uganda they were government-run. While this needs to be investigated further, perhaps this was the start of a general trend of how NGOs operated in those countries. For example, Uganda's current government, under Museveni, is well known for its active HIV and AIDS prevention campaigning. And here you can see an example of that. Despite Indigenous participation, however, it must be remembered that the overseas branches usually had staff, especially in the upper echelons, which were of European origin, and that these were dependent on the orders of the British Red Cross headquarters in London. Within their correspondence, frustration with the local population is often evident. For example, on April 4th, 1959, the field officer of the Uganda Red Cross, Sue Maltby, wrote to Joan Whittington, the director of the Overseas Department, that, "Although we are always trying to bring the Africans and Asians in, one can never leave anything to them. They have to be spoon-fed and pushed along all the time," end quote. She was not the only one to make such generalized observations. During her tour of West Africa in 1954, Lady Angela Limerick, the vice president of the British Red Cross, noted in her official diary that Nigerians make quite intelligent doctors, but they have a streak of irresponsibility which is difficult to eradicate, end quote. Both these quotations can be read as racist and patronizing, even if well-intentioned, and thus show us something about the attitudes of people whose life's work was to serve those in need overseas. These attitudes also transferred into evaluations of African mothering practices. While Red Cross child welfare clinics, which were often staffed by Africans, represented the professionalization of natural motherhood, not all mothers who brought their children to clinics were deemed to be motherly. Lady Limerick observed this during her tour of Eastern and Southern Africa in 1958. In an official journal entry of October 31st, 1958, after visiting a Red Cross baby clinic in Swaziland, she indirectly accuses one mother of consuming her baby's milk rations. She writes, and I quote, "In one case, despite the provision of milk, the infant never seemed to put on weight, whereas the mother, a large buxom type, seemed to grow steadily larger. So they put her on the scales, and she hasn't been back since. But mostly the mothers are only too happy to do all they can for the children, although even the most elementary maternal instinct seems to be completely lacking in some cases." Thus, intervention in the family, specifically in motherhood, became necessary in the name of medicine and national health, as some African mothers were deemed incapable. To combat this, the Red Cross published mothercraft manuals and promoted mothercraft classes with a practical focus on hygiene and health, which would compensate for this lack of an elementary maternal instinct. While Wellborn and the British Red Cross were both health service providers that operated at the grassroots level and targeted children and mothers, sometimes even in collaboration, their underlying approaches were very different. Wellborn was a British physician representing the Ugandan government and the privileged international medical community. Through her medical knowledge, she sought to help African families adjust to modernization, while she seemed to emphasize cultural preservation in her parenting manual by fondly harking back to the old days. She nevertheless provided parents, primarily mothers, with tools to advance alongside the social and economic progress that seemed to be engulfing Uganda in the 1950s and 60s. The cultural integration in her book of Old and New would allow Ugandan parents to cope with change. The British Red Cross, on the other hand, was and is a charity that is part of the International Red Cross and Red Crescent humanitarian movement. During the 1950s, it seemed to support the notion of Western progress in Uganda and the Gold Coast, focusing on the future rather than on the past. Adhering to the universal principles of the international body of the League of Red Cross Societies, this is not surprising, as its international membership, as well as its British headquarters, negated some of its local flexibility. Despite these differing views, however, it is also noteworthy to point out that both Wellborn and the British Red Cross had an African staff to help carry out their mandate. In examining health through the work of Wellborn and the Red Cross and their African subordinates and volunteers, it becomes obvious that the seemingly neutral field of medicine was not so neutral after all, as good mothering practices in the context of increased Western influence and decolonization were closely linked to national well-being and nation-building, and were hence of great concern to those involved. For those familiar with contemporary development practices, you may have been surprised that I have been discussing mobile child welfare clinics that targeted women within a colonial context. The targeting of women in international development initiatives is not as innovative as recent as some would have you believe. Broadly speaking, this is why the historicization of international development initiatives is important. In my case, as children are central to international development, the maintenance of their welfare is an ideal lens with which to question what development actually was and is, ultimately allowing for a better understanding of the approaches with which the West seeks to assist the developing world. Thank you.